The markings appeared every sunrise, always on the same patch of hide, always the exact same depth, and always bleeding fresh. 13-year-old Lila McCrae stood by the cedar fence, her gaze locked on the newest wound marring the flank of her prized Mustang, Arrow. I would love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Share it below, join our family, and let's dive into the story. The sleek black horse stood perfectly still, seemingly resigned to this bizarre nightly ritual. 3 shallow parallel slashes, each precisely 4 inches long, were etched into his dark coat with unsettling exactitude. But the silence was the most disturbing part. Arrow, a high-strung animal that whinnied at the sound of a falling twig or a distant coyote, stood mute through whatever trauma he endured each night. He never made a sound when it happened, nor when Lila found him. She trailed a hand along the rough wood rail, counting the occurrences 21 mornings. 21 sets of razor-sharp cuts, always fresh, always dripping crimson onto the dry scrub beneath him. She glanced toward the clapboard house where her uncle, Jed McCrae, sat on the veranda, sharpening an old hunting knife, as if the world hadn't tilted into a realm of the inexplicable. Since the 4th morning he hadn't mentioned the wounds, simply grumbling that a wild animal must be rubbing itself raw on the barbed wire. But barbed wire didn't carve perfect parallel lines. And barbed wire didn't explain why every other beast on their isolated ranch, the Triple M, remained untouched. Something was targeting Arrow. Something that operated under the cover of darkness, wielded a blade with the skill of a master surgeon, and vanished before dawn without leaving a discernible trail in the dust. Lila McCrae had always been the first person stirring on the ranch. At 13, she managed the morning routines with a focus that belied her age, collecting eggs from the coop, slopping the pigs, and always finishing at Arrow's paddock. The pattern had been unwavering for 4 years, ever since the fever took her mother and left her uncle Jed adrift in silent melancholy. But 3 weeks ago everything changed. She vividly recalled the first morning, the sun just clearing the horizon when she spotted the 3 cuts on Arrow's right shoulder. Fresh gore lined straight as a ruler, each incision identical. Her initial thought was a mountain lion, though the wounds were too clean. Her next instinct was to tell Jed, running across the hardened ground with her heart hammering in her ears. Wild animal got at him, Jed had pronounced, examining the cuts with his calloused hands, his expression registering annoyance more than alarm. Must have snagged himself on something in the dark, but the next day brought 3 new cuts on the opposite flank. Same depth, same length, same unnerving precision. And the morning after that, 3 more near his hindquarters. Each time, Lila found Arrow standing calmly, seemingly untroubled. By the 8th day, she started a meticulous log. She sketched Arrow in her school slate, marking each group of cuts with precise charcoal strokes. The design was chillingly systematic. The wounds circled his body, never overlapping, always in sets of 3. The most baffling aspect wasn't the cuts, it was Arrow's demeanor. The usually skittish black Mustang, who balked at a loose pebble, stood perfectly still during her inspections. He would lower his massive head and let her touch the injury sites, his dark eyes holding a strangely knowing look, as if trying to relay a secret. Lila began rising earlier, determined to catch the perpetrator. She lay in her narrow cot, listening for any disruption, but the nights were silent. No frantic snorting from Arrow, no sound of struggle, no alien footsteps, just the usual nighttime cadence. The wind in the pines, the distant hoot of an owl, the dry rustle of sagebrush. This morning, as she approached the corral carrying a bucket of grain, she noticed a change. Arrow was in his usual spot, but his ears were pinned forward, focused. 3 fresh cuts marked his neck, but his entire attention was directed beyond the ranch perimeter. Lila followed his stare toward the dense cluster of mesquite trees marking the edge of their claim. Something had been watching them, and it had just vanished into the shadows. Lila slipped beneath the fence rails and walked toward the mesquite, her worn boots crunching on the brittle earth. The morning air carried the scent of dust and juniper, but underneath she detected an alien odor, a sharp chemical smell that made her think of the antiseptic Jed used on deep gashes. She knelt where Arrow had been looking and studied the ground. The soil here was softer, disturbed. Someone had definitely been standing right there, observing the paddock. The prints were partially obscured by dead leaves, but she could clearly distinguish the shape of heavy boot heels, the size of a large man. "Morning," "You're out early today." Leela whirled around, a gasp catching in her throat. Virgil Hardin stood 10 yards away, holding a coiled leather lariat. The foreman of the neighboring spread, the Lazy H, was a tall, lean man with prematurely graying temples and cool, discerning eyes that absorbed everything while revealing nothing. He'd worked the adjacent property for as long as Leela could remember, but she'd never seen him this close to their boundary line before dawn. "Mr. Hardin," she managed, trying to keep her voice even, "I was just checking on Arrow. That black gelding giving you grief?" Virgil's expression was as guarded as Leela's own curiosity. "Heard he's been having some trouble lately. How did you hear that?" The question was more accusatory than she intended. Virgil's face remained impassive, but a fleeting darkness crossed his eyes. "This territory's small, news travels fast." He nodded toward Arrow. "Mind if I take a look? I've handled plenty of injured stock." Leela instinctively wanted to refuse, to tell him to stay off their land and keep his odd questions to himself. But a desperate part of her hoped that a seasoned man might recognize something she missed. Maybe Virgil Hardin held the answers. They walked back to the paddock, and Virgil examined Arrow with the practiced hands of an old-time stockman. He studied each grouping of cuts meticulously, his fingers tracing the edges without making contact. His face was unreadable, but Leela noticed his eyes flicking toward the mesquite trees several times. "These are unique," he finally stated. "Remarkably precise. Almost like someone used a surgical instrument." "An instrument?" Lila's stomach nodded. "But why would anyone hurt Arrow on purpose?" Virgil straightened and looked directly at her. His gaze held a profound, unsettling awareness, as if he understood an underlying mechanism she couldn't grasp. "People do things, Selena, that defy common sense. Sometimes, the reasons are invisible to the rest of us." He handed her the rope he was carrying. "Tell you what, keep this handy. Use it to tether the gelding closer to your cabin at night." As Virgil walked away, Lila realized he had offered no explanation for his own presence near their boundary so early, and he never answered how he knew about Arrow's strange injuries. That evening, Lila sat at the pine table, barely touching her stew, while Jed ate in silence. The rope Virgil had given her lay coiled beside her plate, its rough fibers catching the light from the oil lamp. She wanted to question Jed about their neighbor, about why he seemed so knowledgeable about Arrow's plight. But Jed McCrae had grown even more remote since her mother's death. Questions were often met with stony silence. "Uncle Jed, do you trust Mr. Hardin?" Jed looked up from his bowl, a flicker of surprise in his weary eyes. Virgil's been the Lazy H foreman for years. Never had a reason to distrust him. "But do you know him? I mean, what does he do besides manage their stock? I never see many head on his side, and their stables look empty most days I ride by." Her uncle's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "That's not our concern, Lila. A man has a right to his privacy out here." After their meal, Lila used the leather lariat to secure Arrow nearer the house, as Virgil had suggested. The proud horse seemed agitated by the change, pawing at the dirt, and frequently looking toward the mesquite line. She fed him extra rations and spoke to him in calming tones, but his ears remained forward, constantly catching sounds she couldn't hear. She went to bed fully clothed, waiting. The old cabin groaned around her with familiar sounds. Sleep was impossible. Every small sound made her tense. A floorboard settling, wind rattling the window pane, the distant howl of a dog. But the hours passed, and she heard nothing from the vicinity of the tethered horse. She must have drifted off, because she woke to the sound of Jed moving below. Gray dawn light filtered through her window. Lila pulled on her boots and crept downstairs, past her uncle who was building the fire, and out into the cool air. Arrow stood exactly where she had left him, the rope still knotted securely around his neck. But her heart plummeted as she approached. 3 new cuts marked his foreleg, fresh and precise as ever. The rope had made no difference. But something else had changed. The ground around Arrow showed clear boot prints in the heavy morning dew, the same large heels she'd noticed near the mesquite. Whoever was doing this had come right up to the cabin, worked on Arrow with the horse tied barely 20 feet from her bedroom window, and she had heard absolutely nothing. As she knelt to examine the prints, she spotted something that sent a surge of cold terror through her veins. The boot prints led straight back toward the Lazy H property. More unsettling still was what she found embedded in the soft dirt beside the deepest print, a small piece of metal gleaming in the early light. She picked it up. It was a brass button tarnished and heavy, with a complex strange crest carved into its surface. Lila recognized it instantly. She had seen that button yesterday morning, on Virgil Hardin's suede riding vest. Lila clutched the brass button as she walked back to the cabin, her mind racing. The evidence seemed undeniable, but a sliver of doubt remained. Maybe the button had been lying there for weeks, maybe it belonged to someone else. But deep down she knew what she had found. At breakfast she studied her uncle's face across the table. Jed McCrae looked every bit his 50 years, his beard streaked with gray, his hands permanently lined from ranch work. She wanted to show him the button, to share her mounting dread about their neighbor, but something held her back. Jed had enough burdens without her adding suspicions that might destroy their uneasy truce with the Lazy H. "Uncle Jed, I need to ride into Red Rock today. We're running low on coffee beans." It was a pretense. They had plenty of coffee. But Lila needed time to think, and the 10-mile ride to Red Rock would provide it. She saddled their aging mare, Belle, and set off down the dusty track that wound between the Triple M and Lazy H properties. As she passed Virgil's ranch, she slowed Belle and studied the land. The barn doors were shut, as usual, and no smoke rose from the chimney, despite the crisp morning air. For a man who managed a massive spread, Virgil's place showed a peculiar lack of life. In town, Lila tied Belle outside Brody's General Emporium and wandered the aisles, trying to appear nonchalant while her thoughts boiled. Mrs. Brody, a generous woman with kind eyes and a welcoming demeanor, eventually approached her. "You look worried, child. Is everything well out at the ranch?" Lila hesitated, then pulled the button from her pocket. "Mrs. Brody, have you ever seen a button like this?" The older woman examined it carefully, turning the heavy metal over. "Interesting piece. That crest? See the carving? That's not a local design. That comes from the East. Likely New Orleans, or maybe Baltimore. Very expensive kind of button for these parts. Do you know anyone who might own clothing with buttons like this?" Mrs. Brody grew thoughtful. "Only person I can recall is Virgil Hardin. He came through here a few years back wearing a fine coat with buttons just like this one. Said he'd come from the cities, but that was before he settled on the Lazy H next to your family." Lila's anxiety tightened. Did he say anything else about why he left? "He's not a conversationalist, that one. But I remember thinking it was strange for a city man to take up ranching so sudden, especially considering he didn't seem to know much about cattle when he first arrived." The ride home felt infinitely longer. Lila's mind circled the same terrifying questions. If Virgil wasn't truly a foreman, what was he doing on the land next to theirs? Why his obsessive interest in Arrow's injuries? And most horrifyingly, why was he sneaking onto their property every night to carve into a harmless animal? As she approached the ranch, she saw Virgil's tall figure standing right by their fence line, apparently scrutinizing something in the soil. When he noticed her riding toward him, he straightened and waved, his expression guileless and friendly. But Lila saw him quickly step away from the spot he'd been examining. Lila dismounted and approached Virgil with deliberate steps, the brass button a heated weight in her pocket. He smiled, the same easy smile as the day before, but now she noticed details she'd missed. His suede vest was missing a button near the lapel, leaving a small telltale thread. His hands, which he kept tucked behind his back, showed faint, fresh abrasions across the knuckles. "Afternoon, Lila. How's that black horse holding up today?" "Fine," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite her pounding pulse. "What brings you over to our side of the fence, Mr. Hardin?" Virgil gestured toward the ground where he'd been standing. "Thought I noticed some unusual spoor here. Wanted to make sure you folks weren't having trouble with predators." Lila looked at the spot he indicated. The earth was scuffed and raked, as if someone had hurriedly scrubbed away any identifying marks. "What kind of tracks? Hard to tell now. Could have been a wolf, could have been something else." His eyes held that familiar, unsettling, knowing look, but this time it felt openly menacing. "You've been keeping Arrow tied up closer to the cabin like I suggested." "Yes, sir. Good girl. That ought to keep him secure." Virgil started walking back toward the Lazy H, then paused and looked over his shoulder. "You know, Lila, nosiness can be a real hazard for a young girl living so far out here. Sometimes it's best to leave well enough alone." As he disappeared behind the mesquite, Lila felt a deep, cold dread settle over her. The warning was explicit. He knew she was getting too close. That night at supper, she finally resolved to tell Jed everything. She placed the tarnished brass button on the table between their plates and explained the tracks, her conversation with Mrs. Brody, and Virgil's ominous behavior. Jed listened without interrupting, his face sinking with worry with every new detail. "You're sure this button came from his vest? I saw the thread where it was missing," she insisted. And Mrs. Brody remembered the crest from when he arrived. Jed picked up the button, turning it over in the lamplight. "These are serious accusations, Leela. If you're wrong about Virgil, it could mean violence between us. But if you're right, he's been sneaking onto our land every night, harming an innocent animal." "Why would anyone do that, Uncle Jed?" Her uncle was silent for a long moment, the button resting heavy in his palm. "I don't know, daughter, but we'll find out tonight. We're going to keep watch together. If someone's trespassing on our claim, we'll catch them in the act." For the first time since the cuts began, Leela felt a sliver of hope. They spent the evening preparing. Jed cleaned his old lever-action rifle, while Leela gathered blankets and filled a canteen with water. Their strategy was simple. They would hide in the hayloft of the small barn, which provided a clear view of both the tethered Arrow and the fence line leading to the Lazy H. As darkness fell, they hid in the hay bales, watching Arrow in the moonlight. Hours of tense silence passed, until near midnight, a soft thud followed by Jed's low cry of pain broke the quiet. "Can't draw breath," he wheezed, clutching his chest. Leela's blood ran cold. She had to get him to Red Rock, but Jed insisted she stay and watch. Panic-stricken, she heard footsteps below, slow, deliberate, heading for the horse. Through the window, she saw Virgil's silhouette, holding a slender, gleaming metal object. Jed groaned, worsening rapidly. Leela felt the impossible choice, but whispered, "I have to stay." She pressed to the window and watched Virgil approach the horse. Arrow stood still, not afraid, but anticipatory. Virgil spoke softly, then knelt, working with the metal. Leela realized it wasn't a knife, but a tool. He made the precise cuts gently, appearing to remove small dark objects and collecting them in a pouch. The wind shifted, bringing Virgil's voice. "Just a few more, and you'll feel relief." Everything clicked. Arrow was infested with bots, fly larvae, burrowed under his skin, and Virgil was surgically extracting them. The cuts were not cruelty, they were operating sites. Virgil looked up, his expression weary and isolated. He set down his tools and climbed to the loft. "Is your uncle all right?" he asked. Leela confirmed Jed was breathing better. "You were helping Arrow," she accused. Virgil nodded, showing her the dark, maggot-like larva. "Bots. They'll kill the horse, if not removed." "Why the secrecy?" Virgil's shoulders slumped. "My name is Dr. Alistair Thorne. I was a vet in Baltimore, and lost my license after a prize racehorse died. I came here to disappear. I was afraid people would run me out before I could help any animals. But I couldn't watch Arrow suffer." Jed managed to sit up. "Why didn't you trust us?" "Because I was afraid they'd run me out of town," Thorne admitted. "I've been treating sick livestock all over, always in secret." Thorne checked Jed's pulse. "You had a severe stress reaction, Mr. McCrae. Your heart is strong, but you need rest." In the following weeks, the community heard the truth. Instead of condemnation, they offered Dr. Thorne understanding and an informal chance to practice veterinary medicine again. Arrow healed completely, his coat growing back over the scars. Leela found him healthy and vibrant every morning, finally free from the creatures that had been slowly killing him.